let's continue to talk about culture and how we can influence culture from an organizational standpoint, from a business. Let's talk of the business field. And there is one organization that is influencing a lot of culture right now, and that's Meta. You know, the organization formerly Facebook, obviously owns Facebook and Instagram and everything like that. And let's look at their culture. We know that they are renowned for not having the best culture. You know, obviously Zucks has done his recent tour and interviews to try to, polish the brand name a little bit recently. And it was every response that he gave was just so political and just so manufactured. And you're like, oh yeah, Robot Mark is back. But we've heard stories about how negative Facebook and Instagram is for especially our younger culture, right? Our younger generation. And there was some articles that were leaked a number of years ago that actually were done by internal teams at Facebook and found out and proved that their algorithm and everything was actually counterintuitive to mental health and mental health of its users. And, it was obviously tried to be silenced and everything like that. And it came from one of their teams called the Responsible Innovation Team. And obviously they were put in place to try to, combat the negative stereotype that their platform has and their organization has. And they try to improve the ethics and the culture of how it's operated and the organization is run. Unfortunately, we see a report recently where that team has now been not fired, but let's say dissolved, and those members have been moved into other areas of the organization doing other important works as Facebook reports or as Meta reports. But it kind of brings up this thing that we know that they've got this bad culture. We know that they have this bad influence. They had an internal team that kind of monitored their bad influence. They still didn't listen to that team and then eventually dissolved that team. And it kind of made me think of, corporate social responsibility. And we as leaders in organizations, there's this, obviously we have a responsibility to shareholders, we have a responsibility to our key stakeholders, our employees, our clients, our suppliers. We have responsibility to them. But in recent years, there's been this shift of focus to corporate social responsibility. Our environmental impact, our community impact, and all those sorts of things. And it's funny that we as organizations can look after planting the trees and trying to decrease our carbon footprint and everything like that. But a company like this dissolves a team because they know that they are not socially responsible with mental health. Dr. Rod, how do we as leaders, now some people might be leaders in large organizations that are responsible for corporate social responsibility, but we may also be leaders in local churches, in small businesses, etc. How can we, or what can we learn from corporate social responsibility in our leadership?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. That is, I think to some extent, look, there was no talk of corporate social responsibility, say, in the first half of the 20th century, because managers understood that there was more to their business than making a profit.
Yeah.
And then there was a significant shift around about the middle of the 20th century, and a stronger and stronger emphasis began to be made on making a profit.
Yeah.
Until we sort of get down towards the late 1970s, early 1980s, when people started to think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe we're putting too much emphasis on profit, And that's when this idea of corporate social responsibility was developed, and a few articles started to appear in management magazines and so on. You can blame economists for the focus on profit, because there were some very famous papers written around about the middle of the 20th century saying that as long as businesses pursue profit, everything will be fine. You know, that's the best social goal.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman famously wrote a short paper in 1972 to the effect that, you know, the social responsibility of business is to make a profit. And certainly there are some theologians who would argue that today, that that's really what the focus ought to be. But it was a bit of an aberration, and we get into the 1980s, 1990s, and then into the 21st century when we've said, well, look, large businesses in particular, what we call joint stock companies or public companies, they only exist because the people have given them social license. And in a way that's true, because there was no such thing as the public company or the joint stock company or limited liability company until around about 1850, when it was the British Parliament that passed legislation that allowed a company to be established with a limited liability, which means the owners, the shareholders, weren't responsible for the debt of the company should it be wound up. And the most they could ever lose was the value of their shareholding. Now, that's had pluses and minuses, because it's allowed business to access very cheap capital, really, capital at zero price, because they don't pay interest. They just pay a dividend if and when they make a profit. So it's enabled enormous development, has probably contributed significantly to economic growth. But of course, what's happened, I think, with corporate social responsibility, that it's really been captured, again, I'm sorry to say, by the cultural Marxists. And now we're seeing large corporations actually wield enormous power in trying to push society in a particular direction. And I don't think that was the original intention of corporate social responsibility, which was all about businesses caring not just about profit, but also about people within their organizations and in the communities around them, and also about their impact on the environment. Now we seem to have an ethos that says the environment is just as important as the people, whereas, you know, God's got a bit of a hierarchy, well, not a bit, he's got an explicit hierarchy in creation. We are given dominion, which we probably haven't exercised in quite the right way during human history. But I think what's happening now is that we're seeing large corporations act in ways which really are political. And, you know, that they've really moved in and taken over to some extent the role of government. And I think that's a very dangerous development. Now, for those of us who are leaders within those large corporate structures or within big government departments and so on, it can be a pretty difficult thing, because you may find that there are clashes between what's going on corporately in the corporate culture and your own system of values and beliefs. Again, I think it's really important to know where you stand and why. But as Craig's mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean you've got to go in and battle against everything. You know, you need the wisdom of God, you need the nudge of the Holy Spirit to know when it is time to speak out, because obviously you risk losing your job. And so that can have devastating personal consequences. So know what it is that you believe in and why, and know for sure when and how you move, if you are going to move within the company to stand up against something, or whether you should, you know, just quietly withdraw. And I respect the decision that people make in these matters, because it is something personal between you and God. Now, if you happen to be the CEO, again, you don't necessarily have the freedom to, as it were, impose your own system of beliefs, because you're answerable to a board. But look, if you are in a position where you're the owner, you own a private company, for example, then I think you have a responsibility and, of course, the right as the owner to build culture. And, you know, culture is one of those things that really comes from the top down.
Not only the right, you're expected. Like that's what I teach
Oh,
people.
absolutely.
Like it's not like only you have the right. You must, because if you don't set the culture, someone else will.
It will. If you let it bubble up from below, you've got absolutely no control over how your culture grows and develops.
Yeah.
So it is something that has to come from the top down. And look, these days, even legally, in the case of large corporations, it's the board which is held responsible for the culture.
Yeah.
And the culture is not just about a few individuals here and there. The culture is something that is owned, it's contributed to by everybody within the organisation, but it really has to come from the top down. You've got to articulate that culture. Craig, you mentioned a little earlier in the matter of mission statements, how you need to include your values in those mission statements. And I think you're applying that in the context of both organisations and the individual.
Yeah.
You need to have your own mission statement. I wrote my mission statement out nearly 30 years ago now. It's due for a bit of a revision, but the fundamentals have never, ever changed. My basic values have never, ever changed.
Mm-hmm.
And look, that corporate mission statement, I think you should be able to put it on one page.
Yeah.
So, I've seen corporate mission statements that go page after page after page. No, get rid of it, because nobody is going to live by something that they can't internalise, and to internalise it, they need to be able to memorise it.
Yeah.
So I've always said short, sharp, and memorable.
Exactly.
One sentence statement about your vision, one or two sentences, no more, about your purpose, and then a list of maybe 5 to 7 key values. And that's where you start with culture, because then everything you do is judged against the stated values of the organisation.
Yeah.
And when somebody is behaving in a way which isn't consistent with those values, you need to pull them up and say, hang on a minute, that is not the way we do things around here. And you need to reinforce, as an owner, as a CEO, as a leader, whenever you see people doing the right thing in the context of those values, you need to reinforce it. As one management expert says, you need to catch people doing the right thing.
Yes.
And, positively reinforce them for that. So I don't know whether that answers the question, Craig, but look, it's a complex area. And I do understand that many of us in leadership roles don't have enough power to be able to change the values of a corporation or to change the culture ourselves. So it's not easy to be a leader in a large organisation, but you can be. You can develop what I call moral authority.
Mm-hmm.
People see your example and they will tend to follow your example. But I really do understand how difficult it can be for many of us in our leadership positions, because we don't have enough authority to be able to make the changes we'd like to make.
100% agree. There's a couple of things that I think we can take from this this meta situation. Is number one, if we create a negative culture and try to protect that negative culture for, like you mentioned, the old way of just pushing for shareholders, and that's the big issue of companies going public, they lose sight of their mission, and then it's just about the shareholders. Obviously the movement of like Jack Walsh, bringing in layoffs and everything like that, like that whole culture of stripping companies apart to be able to just make more money for their shareholders. It's funny how society or the community will tend to right a ship anyway. So Facebook have had this negative culture. They've disbanded this team that are responsible for making sure that they maintain a good culture or try to improve their impact. And yet they're obviously well known for having lost major share price. They're losing lots of money. Their ad revenue business is falling apart. And so it's kind of this, it's not comforting to know that they're failing, but it's reassuring to know that because people always say, but like especially when it comes to leadership and things like this, that people are looking at it and they go, but that person's doing the wrong thing and they're really successful. And it's just showing that, yeah, people may be successful on the outside or maybe successful for a season, but eventually the wheels will fall off. Eventually somewhere in their personal life or whatever, the wheels will fall off. And we're seeing that in the case of Facebook. So I want to go like something really practical about this, because obviously Facebook set up this responsible innovative team, right? Responsible innovation team. Do you feel like it's worthwhile, and how would we go about as leaders creating some form of a moral compass, moral accountability in our organization?
Look, I think it's a good idea. I think for large organizations, possibly it's better to have an external body to do that.
Yep.
Rather than someone internal. They perhaps are able to say things that you might not be able to say as someone who's internal, for fear that, you know, your division might be shut down and everybody dispersed elsewhere in the company. But whatever mechanism you choose, there needs to be accountability. Look, us human beings need to understand we're finite. We make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we do get a little bit too enamored by, say, making a profit over other considerations. And we need to be accountable to somebody. You know, with the corporate model works properly when the board holds the senior executive team accountable to the mission statement of the organisation. But I also think CEOs and, say, board chairs, they need, if you like, their own system of accountability as well. People who love them enough to tell them the truth. That's what I think.
Yeah.
With Facebook and the other social media platforms, of course, many of them did not start out as profit-making organisations. So they're a little bit schizophrenic in some ways. Facebook, of course, never did. Mm-hmm. It started out providing a platform, a digital platform for social connections.
Yep.
And it wasn't until a little bit down the track in its history that decisions were made to actually monetize those social relations. And I think one of the big issues that they've had to struggle with, and that other social media platforms have had to struggle with, is a model which was designed for one thing is now being used for something quite different.
That's good.
And I think when that happens, that's when you're really vulnerable to these misfires, if you like, of moral standards and so on. And I also think in the case of Facebook and some of the other social platforms, they are examples of what I referred to earlier as corporations actually moving in to the field of politics.
Yes.
And the particular field of politics that the big social media platforms have become involved in is free speech.
Yep.
And as we know, they tend to be censorious of views which some people might say lean towards the right politically, religiously, and so on. Now, I'm not very comfortable with the idea of corporations becoming political mediators. That is something which we really need to determine through the ballot box. That is through our votes for politicians, not our dollar votes for goods and services. And I really think this is an issue we've got to come to terms with as a society, Craig.
So we as leaders need to make sure that we're being held accountable. Like that
the long and the short of it, simple.
Some sort of a mechanism.
Absolutely.
I mean, you and I've built a team around me to make sure that as we build the organization, as our leadership development program and everything that we've got running, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be the cult of Craig. I didn't want to have all the control, all the I wanted to be held accountable. So I set myself a team. I've got you as my pastor. I've got not only my pastor, but great experience in governance and in educational institutions, and I've got intercessors, I've got corporate experience, I've got I've been covered spiritually. I've got a psychologist that makes sure my mental health is fine. That's my team to make sure that I'm being held accountable. And thank you for being a part of that, Dr. Rob. I think that we as leaders need to make sure that we have the right people around us, but also not yes men. You've watched a quick excerpt. Well, actually, we know we talk a little bit, so it's not that quick. But you've watched an excerpt from our weekly live full episode of On the Cube Leadership Podcast. If you want to see what more you can learn to become a better leader from pop culture, from business, from politics, from ministry leadership, and from the Bible, we encourage you, hit the subscribe button and join us as we continue to share more and more information like this so that you can become a better leader that learns, lives, and leads on purpose.